Robots Radio presents...
Today's chat is brought to you by the support of all our Twitch subscribers. Through the patronage you provide the Focus Fire chat team through the Twitch platform, we are able to provide you with the weekly podcast as well as the website and other aspects of Focus Fire chat. If you have any interest in becoming a subscriber of the FFC and gaining access to some exclusive features over in the Discord server, please be sure to visit our Twitch account and click on the subscribe button. If you're an Amazon Prime member, remember that you do have a free subscription to Twitch every month that can be used for this. And for those of you who are already subscribers, thank you again for your generosity.
Welcome to Focused Fire Chat. Explore together.
Welcome to Focus Fire Chat Extra Lore, recorded on January 19th, 2021, as we continue our discussion over the Halo topic of the Insurrection. This particular episode will serve as what we have come to call the advanced session of the week's exploration, so congratulations to those who signed up for a deeper dive. Before we go any further, however, we're going to run through a quick introduction of who all we have with us on the show. As always, this is your host, Blue Crew 86. And as has become a normal fixture of all our Halo Extra Lore chats, we have our resident Halo lore expert, pensHALO. Pens, how are you doing tonight?
Doing pretty good, thanks.
Awesome. Well, so when in the intro session, we kind of walked through the timeline of the Insurrection. We talked about, when we talk about the Insurrection, what exactly are we talking about? The specific conflict between humanity, being a colonial after effect of the different planets, and we kind of ended on a note like right at the cusp of the year 2500-ish, that era. We had finished with the conversation about Dr. Carver. So following Dr. Carver's work. And his, and then the argument that he got into about it with Halsey, that work led as a springboard for the resurrection of the Orion Project. And we kind of mentioned that, the Orion Project was something that had been originally intended for I think it was the inner system or interplanetary system.
Yeah, it was, initially the Orion Project was, when humanity was still inside of the Sol system, they wanted to, it started off as a way to try to improve the people who were going out onto the colonies, make them tougher, more resilient, things of that nature, which of course led to military applications.
Of course.
Early on, the very early stages of this were things like steroids and things of that nature. It wasn't until you started getting into, the late 2400s that you started having other types of augmentations on that.
Was that,
and these
would that be because the technology didn't exist for it, or because the desperation, or both? I guess
the technology hadn't matured enough yet.
Okay.
Now, the one thing about the Orion Project was they took active soldiers who essentially volunteered. These were fully grown men. I believe most of the Orion Project was men. There is no reference to women, but there probably were some. So I'll just use the term soldiers and Marines. They had volunteered. They were fully matured, and they had stuff to improve stamina and strength, eyesight, things of that nature. There were some flaws with the Orion Project. Some of the augmentations didn't take well, or they took initially and then caused problems later on. But one of the other things was a number of the soldiers and Marines that were part of the project, it had been determined that they had, latent or sometimes not so latent empathy with the insurrectionists. So that led to issues. But yeah, so the Orion Project had been resurrected, and this was used early on to attempt to quell the insurrection. Now, once you start getting into, like, after 2450, after like 2480 and things of that nature, once you started getting like massively organized groups of rebels, that's where you started seeing the more violent incidents starting to occur. One of the very first ones occurred was the Far Isle Rebellion. Far Isle was an outer colony world, and it was the first one to go into a full-scale revolt, where the populace fought against the UNSC and were active rebellion with conflict. Now, at this point in time, the UNSC really didn't have the experience in this type of combat, so they really weren't able to contain the rebellion. What ended up happening is they resorted to using nuclear weaponry, and they razed the entire colony. Essentially, they wiped it off. They wiped it out. Now, there's a particular code used by the UNSC. The code is Bandersnatch. Essentially, it indicates a major radiological or energy-based disaster. This was the first time that particular code had been used to kind of hide the fact that the UNSC actually nuked one of its own planets.
Yeah.
Now, that code also was used when you were talking about the Covenant glassing planets. But in this case, it was the first time that the UNSC essentially reacted like it did to essentially wipe out, in an attempt to snuff out a rebellion.
Right, okay.
So, now, the one thing that you have to remember about this is at this point, like we mentioned before, is that once you kind of start going down the road of rebellion, it is exceedingly hard to stop. And at this point, the die had pretty much been cast. Every reaction that the UNSC would take would end up causing a counter-reaction by the insurrectionists and would bring more people to the side of the insurrection. Now, like I said, Far Isle ended up being really the earliest indication of this, but what's really known as the true start of the insurrection is something known as the Callisto incident. This was in 2494, and the UNSC had corvettes and ships that would stop and board freighters, like civilian freighters, to check for weapons, contraband, things of that nature. Well, what ended up happening is there was a UNSC corvette called the Callisto. It was going through the process of, checking merchant vessels when it was captured by insurrectionists. On top of just being captured, all the UNSC personnel on board were killed. In response to this, the UNSC sent a battle group of 3 destroyers. And just as a side note, one of the junior officers in this command would later be Admiral Preston Cole. Then Lieutenant Preston Cole. Preston Cole was the rallying banner before the Spartan IIs in the Human Covenant War. He was a major character. So, on March 2nd, 2494, the battle group came across the Callisto. They opened fire with missiles against the Callisto, but the Callisto maneuvered into an asteroid field, and the missiles all missed. Well, as they were closing in, the insurrectionists had actually planted a nuclear weapon on one of the larger asteroids. They ended up detonating this weapon to destroy the asteroid. This actually wiped out one of the ships in total and heavily damaged the other 2. One of the 2 was the UNSC destroyer Las Vegas. The only remaining surviving bridge crew officer was Second Lieutenant Preston Cole. At this point in time, the Callisto had come back and had essentially ordered the Las Vegas to surrender. At this point in time, it was known what had happened to the crew of the Callisto, but, Cole really felt he didn't have much of a choice, so he signaled distress. So the Callisto comes along board, and they dock with the theory of capturing and providing help. Well, Cole actually had baited a trap. He had one last missile.
Because it's Cole.
He had one last missile that was in the docking bay that the Callisto had tethered itself to. It fired that missile into the Callisto, essentially wiping it out, essentially causing massive damage. At that point in time, Cole did a major bluff. He opened up the missile tubes, which, by the way, were all empty, and essentially said, ordered the Callisto to surrender to the AI on board of the Las Vegas. So to essentially get the Callisto back under control. Now, as a side note on this, Cole was actually, if I remember the story correctly, he was slightly chastised about it because he essentially raised a distress flag, and then when it went back against it, which is against all sorts of naval traditions, Cole knew that he would never be able to do that again because no one would ever believe him. So,
yeah, well, and yeah. Once you get caught crying wolf, it's kind of difficult to.
Yeah. So, but the Callisto incident is widely considered the beginning of the insurrection. This incident, essentially, Cole's response. I mean, the Callisto showed the UEG and the UNSC that the insurrectionists were not mucking about, that they were willing to kill. They weren't interested in just capturing. They killed the crew of the Callisto. And then from the UNSC side, what Cole did, a number of the insurrection was like, okay, they're willing to do whatever they want to us. They're not going to treat us honorably at all. So it essentially just started ratcheting up the pressure there. The next incident also actually involved Preston Cole. It's the interaction of the ship known as the Bellicose. Now,
this one.
Just as a side note, this information is found in Halo Evolutions in the story written by Eric Nyland called the Impossible Life and Probable Death of Preston J. Cole. It's actually very excellently written. I would strongly advise if you're a Halo fan, even if you're not, read it. It might actually be on Audible too as an audiobook. In any event, after the incident, at this point in time, Cole was in charge of the UNSC Gorgon. It was a cruiser. The rebels had started to form fleets to fight against the UNSC. So this is when you started to see the beginnings of space ship-to-ship combat, which was a new area of warfare that no one, not the UNSC and not the rebels, really had any idea what the hell to do with. So they were all learning at about the same time. One thing about the Gorgon is it had actually been equipped with a brand new weapon, the magnetic accelerator cannon, which was designed to essentially be the final word when it came to ship-to-ship combat, because it essentially would shoot a slug down a magnetic rail at ridiculous speeds and essentially cause massive kinetic damage. So, like I said, the rebels had started to form fleets, and some of these were civilian ships, but some of them were captured UNSC ships. So the insurgents had actually captured a ship known as the UNSC Bellerophon, and they had renamed it the Bellicose. And it had its own fleet, and it had been pursued by Cole for a long time. In its final encounter, Cole had set up and fired his last MAC round to it. Now, in a brilliant maneuver, the Bellicose essentially had realized that the Gorgon was going to shoot the MAC round, and launched its remaining missiles into the path that the MAC round would take, destroying it. After this incident, there was a couple of messages that went back and forth between the Gorgon and the Bellicose, between Cole and the captain of the Bellicose, essentially taunting back and forth. But the Bellicose ended up escaping at this point. Cole had tried to trap it a few other times to no avail. Not long after this, Cole had met a woman known as Lorraine Castilla, ended up falling in love and marrying her. And she was expecting their child. What ended up happening was a friend of Cole, Admiral Harold Stanforth, sent a message to Cole notifying him that Oni had identified Lyrian as the commander of the Bellicose. Cole returns home and finds that Lyrian had left. It's said that she, I think, was like 7 or 8 months pregnant at that time. And she took everything, leaving her side of the messages back and forth where they were kind of taunting each other after the Macround incident. It was this incident that actually Cole was actually started to be brought up on charges, but Stanforth kind of stood up for him. But it still led Cole to essentially lose his command and be sent back to Earth to fly a desk. Not long after this, it was the Bellicose essentially fell into a gravity well and was destroyed. Conveniently, yes.
Was destroyed.
Yeah. This actually was not the case later on in the Battle of Serpentis against the Covenant. The Bellicose and a ragtag rebel fleet miraculously came through to assist Cole and help defeat essentially one of the major wins against the Covenant that the UNSC had, just before Cole fired every nuke that he had into a brown dwarf, making go supernova, supposedly killing him. Hint:
the probable death.
Hence, probable. I would strongly recommend you read that story for the rest of it, because I don't think I could do justice to it. It's a very well written story, and it's very interesting too.
Let's actually take a break real quick, and then we'll come back, because I think right after Cole's assignment to the desk, there's an interesting development against the insurrectionist forces that we'll want to talk about.
Even in the darkest of places, the light will always find a way through. If you're like me, then perhaps you're looking for more in-depth conversation about Destiny lore. Welcome back, Guardians. My name is Trams87, and I craft bite-sized cinematic Destiny lore videos. So join me each week as I journey into some of the greatest mysteries of Destiny 2. You can find me on youtube.com/Trams87. Stay safe and Godspeed.
All right, so we left. Cole had been back to the desk. He's now presumably dead somewhere. So the story kind of shifts away from him, sadly, because he was really interesting. And we see is TREBUCHET, is that the operation that happens in 2513?
Yes, the Operation TREBUCHET is essentially the UNSC said, okay, they essentially had enough and decided that they wanted to essentially try to wipe out the insurrection or render it useless or eliminate it.
Okay.
So it was initiated in 2513, and it technically lasted more than 10 years, but it was about 10 years of full active duty with the goal to root out insurrectionists and impose order. It was during this time that the Project Orion, those troops were actually starting to be deployed against the insurrection. And it began, which anyone who is a fan of the Halo story will know this, it began in the Eridanus system, specifically Eridanus 2. Slight hint, this is the birth planet of the main character of the Halo stories, Master Chief. Shocking. The UNSC, let me back up, I'm sorry. The rebel forces in this area had been kind of disorganized until a former UNSC, Marine by the name of Colonel Robert Watts essentially organized them and essentially attempted to take over the entire system. In a long-running battle, the rebel fleet was defeated by the UNSC, and then there was also a major ground campaign on Eridanus too, led specifically by the 9th Marine Expeditionary Force, with the goal of capturing rebel leaders. Unfortunately, the results were kind of mixed, and in many cases, they were unable to capture the rebels, and in the few cases that they were, in many cases, the rebels would actually say, "Yeah, you kind of beat us now, but we'll win in the end," kind of thing. That became kind of a theme there with that. So, by 25-24, there were well over 1 million lives lost with civilians, and mainly civilians and non-combatants, because of trebuchet. During this time, Watts kept, because he was such a good commander, he created more and more rebel installations. Despite the UNSC's best efforts, the insurrection kept bombing facilities, and civilians kept getting caught in the crossfire. And in many cases, the blame was being labeled on the UNSC because of this, even though in many cases the rebels were the ones who were essentially blowing up places and killing people. Halsey actually mentions in her journal about a insurrectionist attack on a planet that was essentially friendly to the rebels, which essentially what they did is they took a dirty bomb, and the way they detonated it essentially poisoned the entire planet. So the insurrectionists could be really ruthless with this. These were the kind of things that the UNSC were fighting. And sadly, as in with most of civil wars and things like that, it's always innocent civilians that seem to get caught in the crossfires. As I mentioned, Orion Project soldiers were deployed at this time. Probably the most notable out of it was a sergeant by the name of Avery Johnson. That name should be somewhat familiar with Halo fans as well. An interesting thing about that was that it's at this point in time that some of the conflict started hitting the inner colonies. Reach had some incidents occur. There was a civilian freighter which was blown up above Reach. And also, one of the planets was Tribute, which was in the Epsilon Eridani system. Now, initially, insurgents enjoyed some support initially on Tribute, but they came to realize that a lot of the violence that was occurring was because of the rebels. There's an incident that's detailed in the book Contact Harvest, where Avery Johnson they're trying to stop bomb makers, and they tail them to a local diner, and the rebels there decide it's filled with innocents. So Johnson's a little hesitant to shoot, but the rebels decide to blow things up anyway, and they killed tons of civilians along with some of the soldiers that were sent to stop the bomb makers. Because of that, and this is the one thing that it didn't happen. It didn't really happen in the outer colonies, but you started to see this in the inner colonies, is that people started realizing that it was the insurrectionists that were initiating a lot of the violence that caused civilian casualties. Mm-hmm. So a lot of their support started to drop in those areas. Like I said, this is kind of technically the tail end of Trebuchet, because a little thing happened about first contact with an alien race over the planet Harvest in 2525, which essentially were the opening shots of the Human Covenant War. So the active at this point in time, Trebuchet was kind of put on hold. So to allow the UNSC to focus on this alien force that they knew nothing about. But there were still some operations. And actually in 2525, in the first active operation of the Spartan IIs, they were actually sent to the Eridanus system to capture Robert Watts, which they actually successfully did. It was the first command of John 117, and they successfully pulled off a kidnapping of Robert Watts. So we've now kind of come out of the pre-Covenant War era, and now we're during the Human Covenant War. Now, one thing to remember, Trebuchet was put on hold. It was never terminated. So technically, it is still an active operation. Now, because of the situation of what was happening, the UNSC made offers out to the outer colonies, to all the rebel factions. They made an offer to cease hostilities if the rebels would work to assist in defending against the Covenant. Now, in many cases, a lot of these rebel factions turned that down because they didn't believe the UNSC. And it wasn't until you started seeing planets glassed and populations being eradicated by the Covenant that the rebel factions started working with the UNSC. Now, even though they worked with them, there were some instances where some of these places would purposely cut themselves off from the UNSC communications relay with the idea of, okay, well, we'll see what we can do now, but once this is done and we come out the other end, we want to be in a position that we can still fight against the UNSC and for our freedom. And then you actually had some rebels who actually tried to work with the Covenant. This specifically happened on the planet Biko. It was because of moles within the UNSC. They had discovered about Operation Silent Storm, which was an operation to essentially try to capture Covenant ship. So, with the thought of trying to reverse engineer and try to find out more about the Covenant. They also had information about the Spartan 2 program and whatnot, and they were going to offer it to the Covenant. They actually met with the Sangheili commander, who promptly turned around and killed them all, and took the information anyway. So, one of the other larger incidents during the war involved the Spartan 2 team known as Gray Team, and it was known as the Battle of the Rubble. This was an asteroid habitat, essentially a bunch of floating asteroids joined together. The insurrectionists there were actually trading with Kigyar for weapons. And then the insurrectionists also had plans that they were going to sell data to the Covenant. Part of this also dealt with selling them information, like essentially information about the, I keep wanting to say inner sphere, so I'm crossing the whole Battletech and Halo thing, the inner colonies and information like that. Now, the Rubble had an AI assigned to it known as Juliana, and so the Spartan Gray Team worked with Juliana to try to assist protecting the Rubble. It ended up that the Covenant that was there, they're actually working with the Prophets to try to get information so they could use it against humanity. There was a large force on one of the larger asteroids. Specifically, there were a lot of Ungoys, and whatnot. And the Battle of Rubble also was actually one of the first times we come across Thelvadam, who is the Arbiter in the Halo 2. His fleet was actually one of the ones that was in charge, or that was, kind of in charge of the Covenant operation. In the end, they were able to stop the Covenant by essentially the AI overrode the safety protocols of the asteroid habitat and broke it apart and sent all the asteroids against the one other asteroid that the Covenant was on. It's, kind of a weird orbital bombardment, but they were able to stop stop the Covenant that.
If it works.
And it did at that time.
I mean, there are times when throwing rocks at things work really well.
There is nothing that can't be fixed with the proper application of force. Sometimes you just need a big frickin' rock. Yeah. So once we started getting into the post-war era, I mean, there was a thought that amongst some leaders in the UNSC that humanity would try to band together to try to come back because so much had been lost. However, with the end of the war in the Covenant, a lot of the insurrectionist movements, they began to resurface again with the same goal of breaking away from the UEG. On top of it, a lot of these places felt abandoned by the UNSC, that, they just allowed planets to be glassed and destroyed, which isn't wholly untrue. I mean, but,
right.
You're talking about it from a military standpoint, you're trying to figure out how to defeat these things. And, you lose to them all. You lose to this force almost all the time in space. You can fight them you learned how to fight them to stand still on the ground, but you almost always lose to them in space. And they would do whatever it took to actually destroy people who were trying to flee and whatnot. So it was one of those things that there was no way around it. The UNSC couldn't be everywhere, but because they couldn't be everywhere, those places that they couldn't be felt abandoned.
Right.
On top of it, because in the post-war era, you had a lot of stuff. You had a lot of hardware that was now on the black market. So a lot of these cells were able to get not only UNSC weapons, but they also could get hold of Covenant weapons as well. With the breakup of the Covenant, you had, especially since Kigyar are mainly pirates, they'll negotiate with anybody. They don't care as long as they get paid. So, yeah, you had a lot of instances of that. So these groups are getting stronger simply because they're able to get hold of Covenant and UNSC weapons. You have the planet Venezia, which post-war kind of became a major rebel player it declared itself totally sovereign and eliminated the colonial admin authorities that were there. Also, another rebel faction called the United Rebel Front became a major actor on this as well, along with something known as the New Colonial Alliance. The New Colonial Alliance was founded by a former UNSC admiral by the name of Matthias Drake, and they were really active post-war. One of the first things that they tried to do was actually attempted to hijack UNSC Infinity not long after her commissioning, when she was still in shakedown mode. Led by a former Spartan 4 candidate by the name of Ilsa Zane, she and a crew of insurrectionists attempted to take control of the UNSC Infinity, but thanks to some smart thinking by then second in command Jacob Keyes and also Spartan Sarah Palmer, they were able to stop that. Now, Ilsa Zane had been, like I said, she was one of the first Spartan 4 candidates and had been rejected essentially because her augmentations made her go nuts. But and she actually had been ejected into space, but somehow had been picked up in time before she died by a ship of the New Colonial Alliance and spirited away. The New Colonial Alliance also popped up at Ealin 4. This was during peace negotiations between the Ural-Hane and Sangheli and included Fleet Admiral Terence Hood, the Arbiter, and the brute chieftain Lydius, if I remember correctly.
They gunked that all up.
So, and this is one of the things. There actually was a double agent among the Spartan 4s that were providing security by the name of Vladimir Scruggs. He actually killed his entire Spartan 4 team and allowed a Sangheli mercenary group led by the shipmaster Vata Gajat in to try to kill both the Arbiter, Lydius, and then also if they could get rid of Hood. While this attempt was foiled, it did put a hold on the whole peace process. Another attempt by the New Colonial Alliance was in the planet Oath Lodon. This one was actually not so much, while it furthered the New Colonial Alliance, it was actually spurred by something more basic. It was spurred by revenge. The NCA commander was someone by the name of Daniel Clayton, who happened to be the son of James Cutter from the Halo Wars games. At this point, just, really quick, when Cutter jumped out to pursue the Covenant fleet, he left a beacon, and the UNSC ship Roman Blue was supposed to pick that beacon up. However, then Captain Terence Hood decided to go for glory instead of it, and that is what led to the UNSC losing contact with the Spirit of Fire and essentially writing them all off as dead. Now, at this location of Oath Lodon, there was a Covenant space station they had lured the Infinity there, and then the space station actually had a glassing type cannon that they shot and crippled the UNSC Infinity with. They would have definitely been able to destroy the Infinity and then kill Hood, if not for Spartan Sarah Palmer and a number of Spartan 4s from the Infinity that were able to attack and capture Daniel Clayton. Hood met with Clayton to try to get information from him, and at this point in time, Clayton just decided he wasn't going to talk, but he did mention the NCA, New Colonial Alliance, and that how they would win. And this was just before Clayton was sent off to Midnight Facility, which is a secret ONI facility for the most.
It's a super happy place.
It's essentially ONI Supermax.
It doesn't exist. Let's just leave it at that.
So, and then actually, one of the other big ones was actually detailed in the second season of Hunt the Truth. At the planet Conrad's Point, this is Ilsa Zane returns, and the NCAA commanders and troops are all brought under her command. She brutally trained them to the point where they were highly trained, and these were all survivors, because she, like, people who didn't match up would be killed. And she essentially had the idea of preparing the NCA for war with the UEG. And to do that, she had collected a large amount of nuclear weapons. Now, Conrad's Point was one of the places that a Forerunner Guardian had been activated by Cortana, which caused massive amounts of damage. But there was a scramble between the NCA and ONI to get people on the ground to research, what was left and whatnot, and see if there was anything of use. ONI sent Commander Maya Sankar, who had been doubling as the rebel leader Fray, undercover with the AI Black Box, or as he was mostly known in Hunt the Truth as Blue Cube, by Mashak Marathi. Why are there grenades under my bed?
Why are there grenades? It's the most legit question.
And it's like, okay, I don't care that there's there's all these bad guys coming. Why are there grenades under my bed?
I love how you just fixated on that one thing. It was the best part.
Sankar was discovered, and her one contact who was supposed to be with her ended up killed by Ilsa Zane. Now, but they were able to escape. They escaped to the planet Laika 3, where actually another Guardian had been discovered. Zane wanted to capture this to use against the UNSC, but the UNSC and ONI were on site, and it stopped her just as the Guardian started to be activated. On a side note, this is when Maya Sankar died. However, the AI Black Box had convinced the UNSC to essentially take her brain to create an AI from it. So, as you can kind of see, the insurrection is actually still ongoing in the Halo universe, even with Cortana and the Created out there. It's the insurrections, some of them are kind of bowing underneath Cortana, but some of them aren't, because they simply don't want to be under anyone else's command, no matter how quote-unquote benevolent it may be. Now, the one thing about the Halo universe, in the games we play, we never fight humans. We always are fighting against aliens. That was a deliberate design choice at the time, but it's one of those things that we know how ugly humans can be to humans, but that's never really reflected in the Halo universe. But there is that type of history in the lore. But as ugly as that all is, as we mentioned very early on in the intro episode, without the insurrection, there is no way the UNSC would have even been close to as prepared as they would have been without it. Yeah, the insurrection forced a lot of improvements and advancements, and simply teaching things to allow the UNSC to have some experience in space combat and other things. Now, there's a line from The Impossible Life and Probable Death of Preston J. Cole, where an ONI operative codenamed Surgeon it says this in a report. History looks upon this time as an unfortunate and perhaps inevitable misunderstanding between Earth and her colonies. But those fighting for the last decade also realized that it was the most amazing piece of blind fortune the human race has ever stumbled upon. Had we not been armed and learned how to fight in space, what would have happened in the years that followed when we faced an enemy 100 times worse? Oblivion, no doubt. That was directly linked, that was a quote directly referencing the insurrection. Without that, there is no way that they would even been, the preparation would have been even worse. And, you know, the few victories and stops that we were able to make against the Covenant wouldn't have occurred. You know, if you look at specifics as to what kind of advances came from that, the magnetic accelerator cannon, the MAC guns, they were all developed because, you know, during the insurrection. Titanium A armor, this is all the armor that is on the that every UNSC ship is made for. Soft seal technology, this is what allows the linking between ships to allow boarding and whatnot. The basic ship-to-ship warfare, no one knew how to do that before this. It wasn't until you had rebel fleets and the UNSC was forced to engage in ship-to-ship warfare that there was even the modicum of ideas of how to do this. Also, when it comes to smart AIs, the incorporation of illegal entry protocols and counter illegal entry protocols, you know, security for the AIs and their ability to hack security. And then arguably the biggest thing is the Spartan 2 program. You know, there's no doubt that the biggest thing that helped humanity was the Great Schism, which was the civil war between the Covenant after essentially the Sangheili were thrown out for the Brutes. But those items that I essentially just listed played major roles in the UNSC in their fight against the Covenant.
Yeah, especially, and like what you're saying too, especially against the ability of, like, at least holding the line until we could figure out more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, like I said, I mean, when it comes to Halo, it always comes back to Spartans. But, you know, there's no doubt, like I said, the biggest one out of that is the Spartan 2 program. Mm-hmm. If it hadn't been for that, and, you know, moral implications aside, if it hadn't been for the Spartan 2 program, the Halo, I mean, the Covenant would have just steamrolled. Right. You know, or it would have been a lot closer than we would have expected. And there's still the chance that the Covenant would have fired the Halo arrays, which would have wiped everybody out anyway.
Right. Well, and even the Spartan 2s, you know, again, like you said, moral argument aside, I mean, Spartan 2s led to the creation of the Spartan 3s and 4s.
Yeah.
And then, you know, all the technology that comes from the Spartan program alone is just immense as well. And that all stems, you know, back to what we've been talking about for these two episodes, the Insurrection. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it's one of those things where it's, again, you can look at it and you're like, yeah, this was a terrible thing. And there is no argument, I think, from anybody that it was a horrible process. But the silver lining of this massive thunderhead is that you know, we did get the tools and stuff that allowed us to, or allowed humanity to survive the attack of the Covenant.
Yeah,
I think that. Yeah, I mean that. I think that's a good place to you know, close off. I know we're pushing about 55 minutes at the point, so I think it's amazing every time. I think it's amazing that you managed to get all this information in under the time limit. But for the advanced session, what do you have for us for shout outs?
Just a shout out to everyone at FFC and the Lore Network. They all do great work. Yeah, and then also just both the Halo and Destiny communities. I know that there's been some rough points lately in there, some of which have made me, less than desired to actually sit down and play games. But I still enjoy being part of both communities because I think both communities do great work. There's some amazing people in both. And, that's all I got.
Awesome. Well, first, huge shout out to Pens to you, because again, like I said, I'm still always amazed that the amount of information you can cram into an hour or 2 hours, I guess.
About an hour and a half, I think.
Yeah, it boggles my mind. So huge thank you to you for taking the time, not only to, put it together, but also to jump on and, walk us through this stuff. And, if you guys are just now catching this episode, we have, I think this is the third or fourth one that we're doing. So we're doing a bit of a mini series, if you will, up into for preparation for Halo Infinite to come out. So, definitely go back and give those a listen if you have not already listened to those. They're just as informative as this one. But other than that, I just want to, as usual, thank you for your time. And until next time, remember, with wisdom we conquer, stand strong, stand tall, and keep exploring. With that, we'll begin to wrap the chat up. Thank you again to those over on Twitch for coming to spend your evening with us. If you'd like to join us for the live streaming of the episodes, please be sure to give us a follow over on twitch.tv/FocusedFireChat. Links to all our episode archives can be found at www.thelorenetwork.com. Please be sure to email us at focusfirechat@gmail.com with any comments and or questions for the team concerning the podcast, and let us know how we're doing by giving us some feedback and a rating over on iTunes as well. So until next time, focus your fire and may your light shine bright.
You've been listening to a Robots Radio podcast. Smart shows for interesting people. Check out all the shows at robotsradio.net.